thank you to Ambassador Rudd for the framing remarks. We're going to turn to our first panel. Their job is to try to anticipate what the priorities will be for the incoming Trump administration, what the priorities should be. Moderating the panel will be Peter Hartcher, the political editor and international editor for the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age. He'll be joined by Heino Klinck, the former U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia in the Pentagon of the first Trump administration, someone who had particular responsibility for managing our key alliances and partnerships in the region. Dr. Mara Karlin, who served as Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy, Plans, and Capabilities in the Biden administration and now teaches at SISF. Kristen Silverberg, who is the President and COO of the Business Roundtable and brings the U.S. Corporate leadership view, but previously served with me in the Bush White House and held senior positions in the State Department. And the Honorable Arthur Sinodinos, AO, Australia's former ambassador to the United States. He called me 2.5 years ago from the embassy to convince me to come here, and then through back channels provided packages of Tim Tams to my children. Very, very effective diplomat. So if I could ask Peter and the first panel to come up on stage, and I'll turn it over to Mr. Hartcher.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for your opening remarks, Mike and Kevin Rudd. Mike, as you said, they might be Americans, but they're the only Americans we have. And in the case of Kevin Rudd, he's definitely the only Kevin Rudd we have. And despite all the speculation, we still have. We're very fortunate today. The timing of this conference turns out to be terrific, Mike, because we do know some of the key appointments, or at least nominations for key appointments in the Trump administration. We know Marco Rubio is nominated as Secretary of State, Susie Wiles as Chief of Staff. She doesn't need to go through the Senate, but Defense, Pete Hegseth, National Security Advisor Mike Waltz, CIA John Ratcliffe, Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard, and just in the last half hour or so, the Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick has been announced. And the President's announcement of Howard Lutnick in Commerce, I noted, said that he would have direct responsibility for the US Trade Representative's Office, which I thought was a bit mysterious. And to help us with unraveling these mysteries, we have a great panel. Before we get to the meaning and purpose of the individuals, though, I wanted to start with you, Heino. You've worked in the last Trump administration. This is really a question of priorities, and as Mike Green's already said, priorities are pretty important, especially when you've got an incoming administration sorting out its priorities. It's not the first time an administration will be preoccupied with its domestic politics, and the president incoming has said that his first priority will be the enemies within, rather than the traditional preoccupation of foreign policy, which is the enemies without. But it does make me wonder, and Heino, please give us your best guess on this. The president's priority being on internal affairs initially, does that mean that his appointments, cabinet secretaries and others that we've talked about already, will have more agency to operate on their own, free of presidential diktat? Or does the operating style of Donald Trump that we came to see in his first term mean that no major decisions will be made, or if they are made, he will not hesitate to overturn them in the foreign policy and defense realm? What's your best guess, Heino?
Well, thank you very much for that question. Thank you very much for having me here. It's always great to be back in Australia. I do believe we can look at the first Trump administration as kind of a window on what we can expect in the second Trump administration. The nomination of Senator Rubio to be Secretary of State, I think, is telling. And I think that as someone who is, if you will, part of the institutional body of the Senate, and with his foreign policy experience and expertise, plus given his personal history as a Cuban American, I think is going to be seen as a steadying factor, stabilizing factor in our foreign affairs. I think you're going to have some of that with Michael Waltz also, again, names that I'm sure everybody here recognizes. The president, just like any head of government or head of state, or depending on your system, is going to be the final arbiter and decider of certain things. And we have a process, an interagency process, that has been in place for many decades, many generations, and I do not see that changing. I do believe that there are certain elements of foreign and defense policy that will be top of mind for the administration. Overarchingly, I think it's going to be the reestablishment of deterrence on the world stage, because we find ourselves now at the end of 2024 with a war raging in Europe and a war raging in the Middle East. And I would argue also a much, much more aggressive PRC. You may have read this morning that the Chinese Minister of Defense refused a meeting with Secretary Austin on the margins of the ADMM Plus in Laos. I don't see that as being obviously a positive, that he's not even willing to meet with the Secretary to exchange talking points. You probably also saw excerpts of the meeting between President Biden and General Secretary Xi, where the Chinese laid down some additional red lines in true PRC, CCP fashion. So I think we're going to see the relationship and the challenges brought up by Xi's China as being at the forefront of our foreign and defense policy priorities.
And I have to ask you this particular point because it's been the subject of enormous speculation in Australia, and it's obviously of primary importance here, but also it's pretty important elsewhere. And I have to ask you to speculate because normally journalists, we do that full time, but I'm going to bring you into the into the fold briefly. AUKUS, what's your view of the extent of commitment by the incoming administration, but also the Congress and Senate to AUKUS?
So I think Ambassador Rudd put it, perfectly well by stating that it's in not just Australia's interest, but in the UK interest and the US interest to move forward on AUKUS. I have not seen anything that leads me to believe that from a policy perspective, AUKUS is at risk. Now, as we all know, there are challenges, particularly in Pillar 1. And I think that there are going to have to be some additional efforts made to try to work through those challenges. I do not see the incoming administration, again, I'm speculating as well because I have no more insights than you have on this topic. I do not see them scuttling it. It's in our interest, quite frankly.
Okay.
And I would also say, as Ambassador Rudd eloquently stated, the relationship with Australia has always been the bedrock of our actions in this part of the world and other parts of the world. And as somebody who spent the vast majority of his life in uniform, actually, the fact that we've been together since 1918, every conflict, that means a lot to Americans. And that is something that no other partner and ally in the world has done. And for our national security leadership, this is, again, something that is well respected.
This is a point that Australians always have sort of cognitive dissonance in accepting that Australia is important, as you've just said, the top of the list. I don't know whether it's our natural self-deprecation, we're just such humble, nice guys, or whether it's there's some other factor, but we have trouble accepting that as a fact. And I have to ask you, we'll maybe come back to you later about how much of a fact the President accepts that as. Mara, can I pick you up on the point that Heino's just made about establishing deterrence as the incoming administration's first priority? I'm just going to move my chair, I can hardly see you guys. Re-establishing deterrence, what do you think the elements of that will be? What are the elements that you think the Trump administration will want to assert? And across, I'm talking about the whole planet, traditional American zone of responsibility. If you wouldn't mind having a crack at that, please.
Absolutely, and it's really a pleasure to be here with all of you. So look, I can't tell you what the incoming team will do. It's a mystery, not a secret. You will, as is always the case with differing, with an administration, you're going to have different strands, right? You will have folks who are more internationalist, folks who are more isolationist. You will have diversity within those cohorts, right, in terms of where to focus. So it's important to highlight that. That said, the urgent need to strengthen deterrence has been a theme of the last few years, and I do expect that to be an important theme when we look at the current security environment as well. And really, there are two key elements when we're thinking about deterrence over this coming period of time. One is making sure you've actually got the capabilities, right? There's nothing more credible for deterrence than showing that you have the war-fighting capabilities to do whatever might need to be done at any moment. And the second key element I would highlight is that you have folks on your team, right? The unparalleled network of allies and partners that the United States is honored to be a part of is tremendously powerful. When we look at the largest land war in Europe that's been raging, largest land war in Europe in 70 years that's been raging for the last 2.5 years, it's not US assistance alone, it's actually 50+ countries, including, of course, Australia, who have been generous to try to support Ukraine as it pushes back on Russia's nefarious efforts. When we look at efforts to really secure deterrence across the Indo-Pacific, you had mentioned AUKUS. What an important effort, what a generational, transformative effort. I will just note, in line with what we heard from Heino and Kevin, having personally led more than 50 briefings across our Congress in support of AUKUS, it really is bipartisan. It's extraordinary how much folks recognize just how meaningful it is. So for deterrence to be effective, you gotta actually have the stuff. You have to actually have folks willing to stand next to you and to collaborate with you. And I hope that that will be informative as a new team settles in.
Is it possible to reestablish deterrence with a rampant Russia?
I'm not totally sure I understand the question, all right? So here's the deal. Russia was not going to be stopped, I fundamentally believe, from invading Ukraine, short of some spectacular efforts, like a whole bunch of us sending our militaries to Ukraine, which was obviously not going to happen. Right, so what could you do then? What you could do is make it incredibly painful for Russia. When we look at their casualties, they are downright astonishing. The casualty numbers, right? Hundreds of thousands of people, a heck of a lot more, frankly, than our militaries, thank goodness, have faced in the last few decades in particular. So Russia was going to engage in this conflict. They have continued to engage in this conflict. They have brought together, you know, all sorts of nefarious folks on their team to assist them in this conflict. Obviously, most recently, North Korean troops. So really, the key is how to make it as painful as possible for them and to be able to show that in the 21st century, it's just not okay for an authoritarian country to eat a democracy.
And can I ask you, you mentioned AUKUS. So far, collective deterrence works in that China hasn't entered into a kinetic war with anybody in the last few decades, at least, but it has nonetheless been unrelenting in its salami slicing in the South China Sea and its pressure campaign against Taiwan, among other elements. Do you think the Trump administration has the ability to do what nobody else has yet managed to do, which is to stop the apparently relentless encroachments by Xi Jinping?
China has a fundamentally different of what the global security order should look like, period, full stop. From the folks in this room and most of the folks across the Indo-Pacific. You are not going to change their view of what global security should look like. What you can do is make it exceedingly painful and costly for them to hold that view and push back when they attempt to do so. And so yes, absolutely, we have seen China pushing in a number of different places across the Indo-Pacific. We have also seen, I think, a historic transformation of a number of alliances and partnerships and geometries across the region as well. Whether you look at increased defense budgets, whether you look at transformations in US posture, for example, whether you look at how so many of our militaries are cooperating in new and innovative ways, it is those sorts of efforts that actually help say to China, you can keep trying, you are actually not going to succeed.
And Kristen, can I come to you? among other things, you've been ambassador for the US to the EU. On this question of priorities, we've heard a lot of disparagement of NATO from the president-elect. How do you see the priority that he puts on NATO? How do you see the priority he puts on any renegotiation or restructuring of NATO in terms of spending and other priorities? What's your best forecast there?
In President Trump's first term, obviously he had, in some ways, a very narrow view of our transatlantic relationship. So NATO very focused on burden sharing, and the EU very focused on trade deficit. So he sort of sees our relationship with Europe around kind of equity, like are we being treated fairly by the Europeans? And I would expect both those things to continue. I think he's missed some of the bigger pictures about the strength that the U.S. enjoys because of our alliances, the points that Mara was raising. I personally don't think that we're going to see a kind of immediate withdrawal from NATO. I think we'll see more of the arm twisting around defense spending, and my guess is that that he attempts to sort of move the target for NATO members from 2% of GDP to 3% quickly. I mean, this is bad news for our transatlantic relationship. It's good news for our relationship with Australia, because when he looks at that bilateral relationship, he'll see this is a country with whom we have an FTA that has really served U.S. interests. The U.S. has a trade surplus. Australia is a country that's taking seriously its defense commitments, that's investing in defense. So I think big strains in terms of the U.S. relationship with Europe, but real opportunities for, I think, Australia.
And on that point, if I could come to you, Arthur Sinodinos, please. If Trump pressures the European members of NATO to come to 3% of GDP on defense budgets, and Australia's on 2.1, on a promised trajectory to get to 2.4 over the decade, does that then also bring exactly that same pressure expectation onto Australia for its defense budget?
Possibly. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay.
Sorry.
Well, why don't you both have a crack at that?
Now, Kristen, you go first.
No, go ahead.
No, well, look, if the basic Trump thesis is that deterrence hasn't worked because America's been weak, then you can expect, taken at his word, that he would want to increase US defense spending, and he would expect allies and partners to spend more. I think Kristen is right about the benchmark, not just for the Europeans, but I think for others as well. Obviously, as a strong ally who does a lot with the United States and has credit for things like AUKUS and other initiatives, I don't expect that necessarily offsets the pressure to do more. And it's in our interest to do more, for our own sake and as a member of the alliance. And in pitching this to the US, our line has got to be not that we need them, it's got to be that they need us. It's got to be pitched to the interests of the United States. And what we've got to be able to say to the Americans is that the economic and security architecture in the region is vital to their interests, to remind them of that. And that it can't, if it's America first, it can't be America only. Now, the challenge is that if we all have to increase defense spending, are we also going to be conscripted to a particular view of how the China relationship should play out? And what I mean by that is that under the Biden administration, there's been a policy of de-risking, identify a number of critical sectors that are basically shut off, if you like, from China, critical and emerging technologies. Small yard, high fence is how Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, puts it. Now, in this administration, it's possible there'll be a debate about whether it's more thoroughgoing decoupling as opposed to de-risking. And if that is the case, what will be the expectation of allies and partners? And don't forget, we're in a world that is very transactional. I mean, these relationships between countries are always transactional. We have an alliance with the US because it's in our interest. But this president is particularly transactional. The piece I think we have to particularly be careful for is that, and we'll come to tariffs on China, but if he seeks to raise tariffs on China to 60%, and the Chinese say, let's do a grand bargain on this, The question is whether the Chinese, as they are wont to do, say, well, we'll put other issues on the table. Let's do a real grand bargain. What does that involve? Does that involve security assurances around Taiwan or around the South China Sea? And what would be the decision-making criteria for a president who is transactional and who is very focused on delivering his domestic priorities? Now, there's a very strong, in the Republican Party, particularly in the Congress, a very strong constituency for Taiwan. Some of them even want to go as far as recognizing Taiwan. So I don't know that the president would necessarily go that far, but I put that scenario up because that is the world we are in. We're going to have to try and determine what will be the major factors in the president's mind when he works out how to deal with some of these great powers.
Okay, thank you, Arthur. And Kristen, you were going to answer the question about whether you think extra pressure on the NATO European defence budgets would translate to Australia, so please.
Well, the only thing I was going to add is, I mentioned this point that there are real opportunities, I think, for Australia. And I think Australia has some real agency in that. I mean, there's a sense for lots of countries about how let's wait and see what the administration's agenda is for us. And I actually think there's huge opportunity for Australia to be pushing an agenda with the U.S. This is an administration that's transactional. They're going to be looking for opportunities to cut deals. They're going to be looking for opportunities to go outside the box. I mean, they have a high risk tolerance. They're going to be looking for opportunities to kind of reset deterrence, to develop new ways of thinking about our relationship in the region. And so I guess just my urging to Australian policymakers is to be very proactive and have some agency in sort of presenting to the U.S. ideas about our relationship.
Good point, given that the first reaction of most is to just pull up the doona and hope the whole thing goes away and see if they can last 4 years under the doona. Heino, Arthur's referred to the transactionalism of Donald Trump's approach. And it reminds me of something that, and in particular, whether he wants to attempt a grand bargain with China, reminds me of something that one of Donald Trump's greatest fans, John Bolton, has said, which was that when he was in the job of National Security Advisor to Trump, and Trump was trying to negotiate, very actively trying to negotiate a grand bargain with China, that, according to John Bolton, Trump was happy to cut Australia out of the picture altogether if that was a part of the price of getting a deal with Xi Jinping. Is that a risk for Australia coming into another Trump term?
So let me base my response on my actual experience in government being responsible for the defense relationship with Australia, as well as other countries, as well as Taiwan. I did not see that during my time in government at all. Quite frankly, I saw our defense relationship with Australia and all of our partners in the region, except for one, increase both substantively as well as rhetorically, and I was actually quite pleased by the progress that we made. On Taiwan specifically, we made historic strides in enhancing our defense relationship with Taiwan, and it was based on our interests. So I hear President Trump frequently accused of being transactional. I don't know what national leader isn't transactional, quite candidly. And every national leader is going to act in his country's best interests. It just so happens that here in the region, our interests are, for the most part, aligned with all the other liberal democracies here. And the added bonus is our values are too. So there's been a lot of speculation that, and again, it's all speculation. It's rumored that President Trump, may throw Taiwan under the bus. His first administration absolutely didn't do that. We ended up making incredible strides in having the relationship become more robust, not in a way that was meant to provoke the Chinese, but in ways to enhance deterrence. So for instance, I was the most senior U.S. defense official to visit Taiwan since 1979. Now, we didn't put out a press release. The Chinese didn't launch any exercises, so it wasn't really, in effect, that big of a deal, okay? but it was in our national interest to ensure that we were demonstrating to the PRC that we were going to do what we thought is in our interests and in the interests of the region as well, candidly. And many of the things that you now see regionally, where you have governments saying very publicly, stability in Taiwan Strait is in our interest. You know, you can't separate Taiwan from the international community. These are all things that were said in private during government-to-government meetings. And I argue, and perhaps just because I'm not particularly objective here, a lot of the strides that the Biden administration was able to make in the region was based on the foundation of the work that was already done in the Trump administration. And if you actually compare the national security strategies and the national defense strategies of the Trump and Biden administrations, there are many, many similarities, particularly on China. So I don't anticipate any of our historic partners and allies being thrown under the bus. But I would underscore that I am 100% confident that any read-ahead that's going to President Trump is going to include what is that country's defense budget and what does the trade deficit look like. So that, I'm willing to say, guarantee you that that is going to be an issue. And again, candidly, I think it should be an issue.
And on those criteria, as Anthony Albanese has already made clear to Trump in their initial phone call, Australia has had a long-running trade deficit with the US. We're in a very small club of countries there. I think it's maybe the Saudis, a couple of others. And the defense budget, well, it's over 2%. So prima facie, and the alliance, as a couple of you have said, is well regarded. So prima facie, Australia's in a good position. But let me, now that we've had a good venture into the realm of speculation, thank you, journalists everywhere, thank you. Let me bring it back to some known knowns. And Arthur, can you give us a bit of an idea of, from an Australian viewpoint, of the nominees so far, the names that we've seen so far in those key jobs? From an Australian viewpoint, what do we know of them? Does Australia know any of them? Do they know us? What should we expect of them?
Yeah. I mean, I think to build on the point that was made earlier, I think the national security team, Rubio is good. He's pretty strong. And we've had experience with him on the Intelligence Committee, where he was deputy through most of the time that I was there, and we dealt with him quite a bit. Waltz is I think, going to be a very good ex-Green Beret, a very good national security advisor, has a track record on a lot of the China issues. But look, a lot of the picks are there because they're very loyal to the president. They're very effective in the media. They can carry the president's arguments, and they look the part. They're essentially the three criteria. And you can read all sorts of material about this, about how he went about the selection process in many cases. But being loyal and being effective advocates for his program are the two major criteria for many of the people. He's also paying a few people off. Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who folded his campaign, has got his wish to be Health and Human Services. Now we'll see whether the president will really fight for him if it does come down to a confirmation process, or whether he'll put him up, and if he fails, he'll say, well, I did what I could, etc. End of story. I think in the president's-elect's current frame of mind, he just expects everybody to do everything he said. Because this time around, he doesn't just have the Electoral College, he has the popular vote, and he's got both houses of Congress. So I think we should take very seriously everything that he says, and the sort of program of executive orders and legislation that he will put up. The really busy time is the next 2 years for getting things done, because at the midterms, traditionally, the incumbent party gets a backlash. That may be the opportunity for the Democrats to come back, in which case there'll be less that he can do in the subsequent 2 years. So a lot of activity in this time. He will expect his nominees to get through. In fact, he's floated recess appointments, and he's made it a loyalty test of the Senate and the new Senate Republican leader, John Thune, that his nominees will all get up. Tulsi Gabbard is an extremely interesting choice as Director of National Intelligence, given some of her views about the Russians and whatever. The only danger for the administration is that in saying that they're taking on domestic enemies and enemies within the public service and whatever, is that it doesn't look to Xi and others as if the American government is going to eat itself. What you would hope is that what's happening within the American government is that by applying business principles or whatever it's going to be, including with the Musk Department of Government Efficiency, that they'll provide some new thinking on how government can work. Now, if they can do that, and if there's rigor and structure to what they're doing, that will be great. And in fact, in the Defense Department, if they can reform supply chains, logistics, procurement rules in a way that means there's speed to market, we get minimum viable capability sooner rather than later, that would be fantastic. If Musk can deliver AUKUS, we should put Musk in charge of AUKUS. And I'm not joking. If new thinking is needed to get this done, because the submarine industrial base in the US that we are putting $3 billion into needs a lot of work to get there. The American government is putting money in as well, but it needs a lot of work to get up to speed. And if there's new thinking that can do that, fine. It's just whether we just not have an approach where the administration views internal enemies and says it's got to take them on, and in the process, that gets in the way of actually having effective government.
One sensitive sort of neural point you touched on, Tulsi Gabbard. Arthur, when you were in your previous job as ambassador, as a Five Eyes partner of the US, does this raise questions for Five Eyes partners of the US that the incoming, potentially the nominated Director of National Intelligence has got a history of expressed sympathy for Russia? What sensitivities
I think I would take the Heino line, which is we've got to wait and see. But, you know, gratuitous advice from the outside is she is working for the American people and the American government, and she's got to leave the conspiracy theories at the door.
In terms of government structures and enemies within and all of that, what about a name that I don't think many of us were expecting, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth? Heino, you know, the Pentagon, is it plausible that he is, as is speculated widely in the US media, preparing to conduct some sort of purge of the upper levels of the Defense Department? Or do you think that is...
Let me just refer to my notes.
Yeah, keep calm and carry on. Can you all see that? Yeah.
Speculation, again, in my opinion.
Yeah.
I would also offer very early days. Our election was 2 weeks ago. So let's see what happens. You know, if you look at American history, there have been many episodes where presidents or president-elects have nominated people who either didn't make it through confirmation or withdrew their name, or even made it. We had a president who appointed his 35-year-old brother to be Attorney General. You know, could you imagine if that would happen today? There'd be just as much speculation about that as there is with Mr. Hegseth. I don't know anything about him other than what I've seen on television, okay? And I would say it's also somewhat ironic that he and Vice President Harris's running mate have something in common. They both served in the Minnesota National Guard. So we shall see. I think what's critically important is not just looking at the cabinet positions, but once the departments and the agencies actually fill out the leadership at deeper levels, okay? And I personally believe that some fresh thinking and experience that is not necessarily, and forgive me if I offend anyone here, it's not that you served in an administration, you went to a think tank, you served in the next administration, you went to a think tank. You know, I think that it is in our national interest, quite frankly, to have people with different backgrounds, particularly business, but also, you know, real-world pragmatic experience of actually running things, okay? Now, it appears that Mr. Hegseth may not necessarily fit that category, so, but I would say it depends on who else is going to be in key leadership and management positions, both in the Department of Defense and throughout the entire bureaucracy. But again, it's very, very early days.
Mara, you wrote the book literally on US defense strategy for the Democrats, but still, it's defense strategy. Does the choice of defense secretary, how much of an influence does that have on a new administration's actual strategy, as opposed to some of the color and movement?
Absolutely. It has a massive effect. I've worked directly for 6 secretaries of defense. Like my colleague Kristen, I've been confirmed by the US Senate, and so have played at these levels, to be completely frank. And this is an anomalous choice. Usually when we look at secretaries of defense across administration, these are folks who maybe have political experience, maybe they've been in Congress, perhaps they've been technocrats. That is not the model that we have seen. And it's worth spending a moment reflecting on what does it actually mean to be a Secretary of Defense. It means you are managing an organization of more than 3 million people and their families. It means that over the period of time that you're a Secretary of Defense, you are in charge of how to direct trillions of dollars. It means that you are spending thousands of hours, at least, in the White House Situation Room, advising on how, when, and under what circumstances to use military force. It is a tremendous role with tremendous responsibility. Now, to be terribly technocratic about it, as you had asked about the defense strategy, look, it also means that you've got to prioritize. You've got to figure out where to take risk. And you've got to be a serious leader in implementing those sorts of efforts. And it will be quite interesting to see how this anomalous choice decides to conduct all of these roles, particularly because I think as we all look around at the security environment, it's not one that looks spectacularly positive when you look particularly at key regions.
And while we have you, would you like to offer any observations on any of the other new names, key appointments that we've heard nominated?
I don't know that I have much to offer on that.
Sorry?
I don't know that I have much to offer on that. I think my colleagues have done so.
Okay. What about, Kristen, can I come to you? The president has said tariff is his favorite word in the English language. He's appointed Howard Lutnick now to the job of Commerce Secretary with responsibility for the USTR. What do you expect? And from the parochial Australian point of view, how do you see the tariff near future for Australia?
Well, I mean, going to this personnel question, we think we see a difference between the approach the president's taking on some of the agencies, which is to look outside the box, look for new perspectives, and where it looks like he's heading on his principal economic agencies, which is to look for some well-known experts who would reassure the markets, who would be compelling communicators of his economic agenda. And I think Howard Lutnick fits that bucket at Commerce. You pointed out that in the statement announcing him, it mentioned that Lutnick will have custody over trade and tariff issues, which in a way is not newsy because the Commerce Department has a lot of the tools that are used to implement tariffs. Some people are reading between the lines to say that that may mean that a more junior technocrat is going to USTR, maybe one of Ambassador Lighthizer proteges, Jamieson Greer, Stephen Vaughn. So it could indicate something about that, or it could mean nothing at all. It could just be a line in a press release. But in any event, tariffs are going to, I think, are going to play a big role. I mean, the president is really attempting this high wire act of driving strong growth in the U.S. Through competitive tax policy and deregulation, while he tries to bring manufacturing supply chains home by resetting our trading relationship with countries around the world, and to do those things without spurring a lot of inflation. And that's going to be a extremely, extremely challenging effort. There are a bunch of different tariff policies on the table. One we think he's very likely to implement is this universal baseline tariff. So that's 10% or 20% to countries around the world. We think it's very likely he's going to do that, but with kind of a robust exclusion process. So countries will start a negotiation to try to get out from the 10%, and I would expect, that'll be part of a discussion with Australia, which, as I say, will be in a pretty good position on that because of our FTA and because of this healthy trading relationship.
And you mentioned Robert Lighthizer, who was speculated to be the, quote, trade czar, unquote. What does this appointment mean for him? Is he still in the running, or does this mean we shouldn't expect him in the lineup?
I had the same question. I'm speculating. As Heino says, it's still early, but it looks like an indication that Lighthizer might not be going into a czar role, and most of the reporting on the Treasury Secretary now is focused on other candidates who also fit into this more traditional kind of steady hand bucket. Bill Hagerty, senator from Tennessee, who very well known to business, very widely respected, and Kevin Warsh, who served in the Bush administration with me. So it looks to me like he's headed for that sort of a less controversial, less kind of out of the box view on his economic nominations.
One critical position is always the National Security Advisor, Mike Waltz, in this case. He and Kevin Rudd have known each other for about 5 years now, when Kevin was at the Asia Society Policy Institute in New York. Apparently they got together quite a lot and discussed Kevin's second favorite topic, which is China policy. And China strategy. What can you tell us? Do any of you have any observations about Mike Waltz, what we should expect there, what his frame of reference is?
Please, no, Arthur, please.
Look, quite a China hawk. Former Green Beret, very well educated. I think he fits the bill well. The question with national security advisors always is how broad is their remit going to be? So with Jake Sullivan, he's had a very broad remit across not just international security policy, but a lot of international economic policy as well. And indeed, he was one of the authors of Biden's international economic policy when Biden was running for office. It strikes me that Waltz will be more traditionally focused on sort of foreign affairs and defense, if you like, and the international security aspects of things. And because he's a China hawk, he may become the locus of this debate that I mentioned earlier around how much de-risking, how much decoupling, and to what extent allies and partners are brought into this process and asked to, in effect, follow some of the processes that the administration is talking about. Now, this has happened a bit under the Biden administration, and as Heino mentioned, it was under the Trump administration that a lot of these policies started to spring up. One example was Mike Pompeo going around Europe telling everybody to clean up their telco networks and get Huawei out of there, something that we had done before anyone needed to tell us to do it. But what I'm saying is it'll be interesting to see whether Waltz has that sort of focus as well. But I was actually quite heartened by that appointment. I thought that was good. I think the appointment of Susie Wiles in the White House as Chief of Staff is a good appointment. She understands the President-elect. She's worked with him on campaigning in Florida for the last couple of years. She was brought in to organize his office at Mar-a-Lago. And she's, I think, credited as someone who understands where he's coming from, help him implement his agenda, but she also understands how to potentially manage him, in inverted commas, in his own interest.
Could I add to Arthur's good point? So in addition to thinking about how wide the substantive aperture is for Mike, it's also worth thinking about the process aperture. So frankly, in many ways, National Security Advisor is not a terribly glamorous job. Unlike being a, say, Secretary of Defense, you do not command resources, you do not command a very large number of staff. What you fundamentally do, where your power is in process. It is bringing together folks from across the entire US government and saying, here's the vision, let's make it a reality. And so it'll be interesting to see how and in what ways Mike is able to do that, particularly given some of these anomalous leaders in the different departments and agencies. To what extent can he help the president kind of set a vision and then actually, no kidding, ensure that you've got the follow through to make that vision a reality?
Can I? Oh, sorry. No, you go.
The one thing I would add to that, Mara is 100% right. But I would also say it's not just process for process's sake. doesn't mean more meetings, or it shouldn't mean more meetings, bigger NSC staff that we've seen grow exponentially as well. It means outcomes. The process and the vision needs to have actual outcomes and results. And I think somebody with the background that Congressman Waltz has, particularly his military experience and the fact that he's been deployed, he understands that policies actually have or should have specific outcomes, will help him hopefully make the system work a little bit more smoother and make these processes effective and efficient, and that it's not just meetings for meeting's sake, which doesn't serve any purpose. A robust system and process we have in place. We've had it for generations now, but we need to ensure that the outcomes are what's in the interest of the United States government and the United States people.
Arthur?
I was just going to quickly add, when I first got to Washington, this was during the Trump era, the Singapore ambassador said to me, he said, if you find the right person in the White House on a particular topic, the point person or whatever, and you get a decision out of them, take it and run. Don't worry about the process. And his point being, it's a bit to Heino's point, that there was very much a business-like approach, right? The president sits there and he's got people coming in all day, and in the President Trump's case, making decisions, right? People come in, decisions get made. And so, yes, process will have its place, but I think they're going to approach process in a more business-like way, if I can put it like that. I've enjoyed in the Biden era the processes that are in place because we've had a chance to influence what goes on, but I can also see an administration that wants to hit the ground running, wanting to have business-like processes, and we'll have to wait and see how that shapes up and how much it reflects the decision-making structure in the first administration.
A day one priority that we've heard the president-elect nominate again and again is ending the Russia-Ukraine war. His key appointments so far have a real mix of people with, this word prioritizers is the euphemism for dumping Ukraine and allowing Putin to have his way with it. We see some prioritizers in the incoming names. We also see some more committed traditional views. Which way does the president-elect jump on day one in trying to end this war? Is it all about prioritizing and getting attention and assets to the Indo-Pacific and to China? Does he try to sustain a serious commitment to Ukraine? Of course, I'm asking you to speculate, but you're expert in your field, so please, if anybody would like to have a crack at that, in our remaining 3 minutes, 30 seconds, please do.
I'll start. Let's look at what the Trump administration did the first go-around. Provided lethal support to Ukraine. Obama administration did not. Blocked Nord Stream. Biden administration did not. So, sanctions on Putin and the government that fortunately have also been doubled down upon. I do not envision that there's going to be an abandonment that some have speculated of Ukraine. I think there are going to be some tough negotiations, absolutely, but I think it's not in the U.S. interest to abandon Ukraine. So I'm not an adherent of that. I do believe we have to prioritize, and the priority should be in this part of the world, candidly. But as former NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg said, you cannot separate anymore one region from another, one theater from another. It's all connected, and we see that very clearly now with North Korean troops deployed in Europe. So I think there is going to be a strategy that is meant to bring the hostilities to an end, but I don't think it's going to be one where we're cutting off Ukraine at the knees.
In his recent book on Xi Jinping, Kevin Rudd wrote that if an incoming American president were seen to be cutting and running from Ukraine, it would be read in Beijing as a sign of weakness, and that Xi Jinping would be much excited and seek to act on that against Taiwan. Anybody want to quibble with that view or concur with it, perhaps?
No, but it is worth remembering, of course, that this war in Ukraine could end tomorrow. It could end tomorrow if Russia decided to stop its unjustified aggression in actually trying to wage it over the last 2.5 years. What we do know is what members of the incoming administration, like the incoming vice president, have said on their approach. It does appear as though that approach is probably to let Russia keep what it owns of Ukraine right now, which is about 18% or so. That is just what at least some of them have said. We will see if that becomes a reality. One would have to assume that because we all watch the exact same television screen for international relations, that will be read in Beijing.
Okay, well, terrific panel, great discussion. And Heino, are you heading to Canberra?
I am.
Could I suggest you make lots of copies of that little
I'll hand it out.
briefing,
Yeah.
your briefing note, and pass it around?
If it makes anybody feel better, it's not just in Canberra.
All right, well, terrific panel. Please thank our experts this morning.